Good evening and good morning to all of our participants, and thank you so much for joining us today. We are very excited to be releasing a new report on renewable energy pathways with our partners from UC San Diego's Power Transformation Lab and the Institute of Energy, Environment, and Economy at Tsinghua University. I am Jessica Gordon, and I'm a Senior Climate Policy Fellow at the California-China Climate Institute, and I will be serving as the moderator for today's discussion. So before we get started, just like to offer a few quick housekeeping remarks. We are recording this event and it will be available later on both our website and our YouTube channel. The event is also being simultaneously translated into Mandarin Chinese. So we ask that you please select your preferred language that you'd like to listen in, and you can use the globe icon at the base of your screen to choose either English or Mandarin. Throughout today's discussion, if you'd like to ask a question of one of our panelists during the question and answer portion of today's event, please type your question into the Q&A function at the base of your screen, and we'll try to answer as many questions as we can live. So we are delighted today to be joined by co-authors and also power sector experts to present the findings from our new report and to discuss the implications for China's energy transformation and the ways that both the national and subnational governments in China can support decarbonization. So this report has a lot of really interesting findings and brings forward important questions about China's potential renewable energy pathways. So we're very excited to share it with you all today. And during the discussion, we'll put links to the report along with the summary for policymakers in Mandarin and Chinese into the chat box. And so now I'll go ahead and get started with the program. So to start off, I'm very happy to introduce our first presenter, who will share some opening remarks. We have with us tonight Dr. Jiang Lin, who's the Nat Simons Presidential Chair in China Energy Policy at the Lawrence Berkeley National Lab. He's also a staff scientist at its Department of Electricity Market and Policy, an adjunct professor at the Department of Agricultural and Resource Economics at the University of California, Berkeley. His research is focused on energy and climate policy, energy and emissions pathways, electricity markets and planning, and also low carbon economic transition. So now I'll turn it over to you, Dr. Lin, for some opening remarks.
Well, thank you, Jessica, for that nice introduction. And thanks CCCI for hosting today's webinar on renewable energy development in China. As many of you know, the power sector is a leading source of carbon emission in the world, accounting for 42% of energy-related carbon emissions, according to IEA. In China, given the prevalence of coal-fired generation, that proportion is even higher, accounting for up to 48% of CO2 emissions from energy industrial processes. In other words, emission from China's power sector is about 1/7 of the global energy-related carbon emissions. So therefore, reducing emission from China's power sector is not only essential for China to reach its dual carbon goals of peaking emission by 2030 and reaching carbon neutrality by 2060, but also critical to the global effort to reach climate safety. According to IEA's Net Zero 2050 report, in order to reach net zero globally by 2050, all developed economies need to reach a zero emission carbon power sector by 2035, and the rest of the world by 2040. That includes China. This is because one of the key strategies to reach economy-wide carbon neutrality is through electrification of other economic sectors such as building, transport, and industries. An electric vehicle without a clean power supply only means emission elsewhere. Today, China's power generation is only about 1/3 from zero emission sources. Building a clean, affordable, and reliable grid not only require a significant increase in building solar, wind, and storage, but also a well-coordinated transmission network and robust institutions governing its operation. Fortunately, China is making progress on both fronts. The National Energy Administration has announced that China plans to install 160 gigawatts of solar wind this year, much faster than its previously announced planning target. And the wholesale electricity market reform is under trial operation in multiple provinces, as well as in the Southern Great Territory. Such efforts need to accelerate in order to build a renewable dominant power system in China, and at the same time, enhance its energy security. As expressed in the latest Chinese slogan, 先立后破. Accelerated progress before 2030 would also deliver broad social, economic, and public health benefits beyond those linked to addressing climate change. They include more jobs and cleaner air. IEA estimates that a net additional jobs in a faster transition before 2030 could be almost 1 million positions higher than the announced pledge pathway by 2030. Our own analysis has shown a similar conclusion of 1.9 million additional jobs by 2035 and almost over 50% reduction in premature mortality by 2035. If such an accelerated transition triggers associated innovation and shifting in expenditure patterns, the net impact on GDP is likely to be significantly positive, further contributing to China's high-quality growth agenda. Given the importance of the power sector, I'm very pleased to see this team of US and Chinese scholars is working together to shed light on pathways of renewable energy development in China. So I'm looking forward to hear about the report. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jiang, for those remarks and really setting the stage for our discussion today. And now I have the great pleasure of introducing one of the authors of the study, Professor Michael Davidson, who will provide a presentation of the key findings from our latest report, Renewable Energy Pathways to Carbon Neutrality in China. Professor Michael Davidson is an assistant professor at the School of Global Policy and Strategy and the Mechanical and Aerospace Engineering Department of the Jacobs School of Engineering at UC San Diego. He studies the engineering implications and institutional conflicts inherent in deploying low carbon energy at scale. Over to you, Michael.
Great, thanks, Jessica. Thanks, John. I'm really delighted to be with you all today to talk about this collaborative work that we produced together with Tsinghua and UCSD and CCCI co-authors. So I'm just going to share my screen here. All right, so I'll jump right in. We're going to be talking today about some context for why we're thinking about renewable energy pathways in China. And I'm going to talk a little bit about the model and how we modified our model to incorporate this a decadal snapshot looking towards carbon neutrality in 2060 in China. And then I'll go through some findings and recommendations. So we know that China has been deploying renewables at a rapid pace. We also know that in order to achieve carbon peaking by 2030 and carbon neutrality by 2060, it's going to have to deploy a lot more renewables. So the question is, if in order to reach those targets, what might be some barriers that might come up on that pathway? And we really can separate our research questions into a couple of different buckets. One is we're interested in understanding, okay, how fast do we need to deploy renewables and what is the structure? So thinking about solar versus wind, versus other complementary technologies like storage and transmission. A second big question is, where are we going to deploy all of this? Where are we going to build the solar and the wind? And how far is it relative to large demand centers and that need to be connected by transmission infrastructure? And then the third big question is thinking about land use impacts. There is certainly a lot of concern around renewables taking up large amount of land. And so if we think not just at today's levels of 100 gigawatts a year, 100 to 120 gigawatts a year deployment, but if we're looking at raising that to several hundred gigawatts a year deployment, what does that mean for land use in the Chinese context? And the purpose of this, taking this snapshot on a path-by-path basis, is to really understand where are there key short-term versus long-term barriers and implementation opportunities. So here's the modeling approach in a nutshell, and I'm happy to go into more detail in the Q&A. Basically, we have a highly resolved land use set of land use layers that are converted into a buildable or a resource potential for at a slightly coarser level of resource qualities, around 30 to 25 kilometer cells for wind and solar. With that resource potential and the resource quality, we then plug that into an optimization where we're trying to meet wind, solar, storage, interprovincial lines as variables and trying to minimize electricity system costs, with considering meeting load in each individual province, reserve requirements, and a number of other technical criteria. And then we layer onto that what could be called technology vintaging, or a myopic decision-making framework, where we solve for 2030, and then we solve for 2040 and solve for 2050, et cetera, to understand and setting each decade's outputs as inputs to the next pathway to see how the evolution of this development might change over time. We're going to present here three main scenarios. So we have our baseline scenario, and as you recall, I mentioned we're trying to optimize wind, solar, storage, and transmission. So we set exogenously pathways of capacity for other technologies, including coal plants. And then for those, we have a set of lifetime, typical lifetimes, and then include CCS retrofits, such that we're following the Tsinghua ICCSD 2-degree scenario. Then we run a couple of other scenarios. One is a conservative cost where the renewable energy falls at a slower pace relative to our assumptions. And then a third one where we accelerate the coal retirement. So instead of coal plants having a 40-year lifespan, we're compressing that to 30 years, and we have a later CCS retrofit. So here's the report in a nutshell, and I definitely encourage folks to take a look at the report since we only have time to go through just a handful of the key findings today. So we're going to be talking about a couple of these key findings, but broadly what we're looking at is increasing renewable energy deployment rates. We're going to have changing regional distributions over time, and I'll show a little bit of that. Certainly a lot more transmission is expected, and land use constraints, as I mentioned, have become more binding. And there's going to be potentially misalignment between where the coal is being retired and where renewables are being deployed. And then I'll go through some of the policy recommendations later. So let's jump to the key findings. So the first key finding is that we're going to have to dramatically expand renewable energy deployment rates. So if we look at historical rates, we're hovering around 90 to 100 gigawatts a year deployment in China. By the end of this period, so that last decade to 2060, that's going to have to grow to 200 to 300 gigawatts a year. So we're looking at dramatically increased deployment. Similarly for storage, in this case, battery storage, is going to have to increase several fold above current deployment levels in order to achieve carbon neutrality economy-wide and in the power sector. So the why we're looking at the regional distributions, so there's a key trade-off when we're thinking about deploying wind and solar, which is that the high resource quality regions may not be right next to high demand regions. And so to connect those two, we might have to build additional transmission infrastructure, which is costly. So there's a trade-off between tapping that higher resource quality and building closer to demand centers where the resource quality might not be as good, but we can reduce transmission and potentially reduce other impacts. And so as we build out further into to 2060 with such large amounts of renewables, we can find that we want to build close to demand centers. And we also recognize the important role of storage. So if we just zoom in a little bit as where solar is going, and I'll show the wind one in a second here, we're looking at deploying a large amount of solar capacity over these decades. And we're also seeing that originally we're starting with building quite a bit in very high resource potential areas, high capacity factors or CFs, but we start to move towards low CF regions, particularly as renewables become cheaper, and then transmission is costly relative to building close to the demand centers. And we also see that distributed solar capacity starts to deploy in the 2040s in very high levels, mostly because utility scale solar has higher transmission requirements and higher integration costs to bring that from more distant locations to demand centers. So we see a lot of everything being built, but changing over time. If we look at wind, we see that, again, wind shifts, starts in these very high capacity factor regions in the north, the northern regions, but then it shifts to other regions, particularly on the coast. We're looking at onshore wind capacity. And then we look at offshore wind, we tend to see a lot of offshore wind being built later in the period along, of course, coastal provinces, partially driven by very low cost declines and also partially driven by the exploitation of a lot of the available onshore wind capacity. Transmission is, of course, expanded greatly in order to achieve carbon neutrality in China. We see similar clusters developing here in the first decade along where existing corridors are, and most of them are connecting the high demand regions with the more intermittent or lower firm capacity regions. And then as we move out to decades later, we're building some of these more, expanding some of these corridors that aren't as strongly interconnected currently. And then as we move out to 2050 and 60, we start to see some very new corridors being built, particularly to accommodate the new generation centers along the coast from offshore wind, for example, from Fujian. If we look at the utilization of these transmission lines, they're of course increasing. So we see that trading volumes are going to be increasing dramatically from earlier in the period out to 2060. And this will imply a pretty dramatic expansion rate of anywhere from 5 to 35 gigawatts per year, which includes high voltage and ultra high voltage lines. By comparison, we've seen roughly 16 to 20 gigawatts per year. So this is plausible, but still an increase over current levels, which is quite dramatic. Land use is a really interesting feature and important barrier to China meeting its carbon neutrality goals. So we see that this is in these plots here in terms of percentage shares of the suitable land that's being utilized by these renewables. So if we think about 100% here means that of all the available land, that is land that's not restricted for renewables use being deployed, then that would take up 100%. And so we start to see is that as we move out to 2060, several provinces start to utilize quite high shares of their suitable land. So we're looking at 50 to 80% in some of these eastern provinces. And just sort of from context here, we look at what are the main constraints on this? Well, utility scale solar is constrained to not be built on agricultural land, and it has other sets of constraints. And so you start to run out of land very quickly. Distributed solar, you can build it on rooftops. And so there's some different sets of constraints, but we build out on the distributed solar as well. Wind similarly starts to build out extensively along the coastal regions. Not quite as binding as the solar constraints, because wind can be co-located on certain lands, such as agricultural land in our set of assumptions, but still very important land use considerations for wind. So the key takeaways here we're looking at are increasing deployment rates are going to be needed for all technologies, wind, solar, storage, and transmission. In the short run, that's going to be much greater than historical deployment rates. And if we look at one concern has been manufacturing or supply chain constraints. If we look at some of those, particularly along wind, solar, and batteries, we see that recent production capacity is sufficient to meet those manufacturing rates, with the exception that we don't know what exports are going to be. But if the concern was that China would not have enough manufacturing to deploy these renewables, we don't find that to be the case on a gigawatt per year basis. As we move over time, the distribution of some of these renewables changes and is driving the deployment closer to demand. And the low cost storage, so the declines in costs of battery storage, facilitates some deployment in higher quality regions. Finally, if we look at the land use impacts, particularly as we note on the eastern coastal provinces, we're seeing increased land use pressure, particularly from utility scale solar and some onshore wind, that's driving different types of deployment structure of renewable energy. And there's certainly a lot of important additional questions on coal retirement and electricity markets that we can get to in the Q&A. So I'll sort of wrap up here with two key policy recommendation slides. And there's a lot going on this because we had a lot to say, but there's a lot more in the report too. So I encourage everyone to pull it up and read some of the more context on these deployment properties. So essentially what we can do is we can look at across all the technologies we're deploying, and then we can look at over the time horizons that we're considering. So for the first decade, second, third, and fourth decade. And this sort of summarizes where the priorities are in terms of the model outcomes. And so as I mentioned before showing the slides, we see quite a bit of high quality regions being exploited in the north and the western regions. So this is again, going for the resource quality where the wind and solar resources are best, building out transmission to accommodate that. Then as we move later on to the 2030, we start to build out quite a bit more in the load centers. And this has been found by a number of other studies, but these are driven by continued cost declines in renewables. And the transmission infrastructure, as we noted before, starts to build out some major north-south corridors connecting some central and eastern regions and other regions. Offshore wind, we find in our model, is not being deployed at as large a level as the other technologies, but it's not to say that offshore wind should just take a beat for 20 years and come back in. No, in order to achieve the offshore wind results that we have later in this period, we certainly need to have continued cost declines and improvements in learning in offshore wind. And so there is still an important role for deploying offshore wind during this period. And if we look at the later half, we're looking at exploiting much of the available land near some of the major load centers for utility solar, as you noticed, as I noted before. And then distributed solar starts to come in, particularly around the coastal regions, because these distributed solar can have lower transmission costs and lower integration costs. And then on terms of the northern, terms of the onshore wind, we're looking at is that there are coal-rich regions in the north for onshore wind that could be coordinated with some phase downs of coal plants for this later half of the period when we start to see more coal plants retiring. And then finally, if we look at storage, we're prioritizing battery storage where there's limited hydro resource availability. So we do have pumped hydro storage as well. And so batteries really fill in those places where there's not a lot of pumped hydro geological capacity. And then finally, in terms of our policy recommendations, we divide these into these two time horizons and then both national and provincial governments. So at the national level in the near term, it seems quite clear that there's a need for having concrete deployment targets in the subsequent 5-year plans. Because of the need to think about storage and transmission and the different timeframes over which the renewable storage and transmission can be built, there's a need for having more integrated planning processes. And then one thing that our model essentially assumes is that we have some well-functioning electricity markets. Now, there are some market barriers that we do consider around reserves, but largely we're assuming that electricity can flow from where it's available to where it's needed with limited transaction costs. And so under that kind of scenario, we need more electricity market standardization to facilitate that cross-provincial trading of electricity. Now, in that same time frame, what are provincial governments looking at? Well, the market reforms are very important in order to facilitate the integration of renewables. Similarly, so that's a regional level, but similarly within the province, there's also an important role for these more local tariffs like time of use pricing that can help to facilitate the penetration of other types of distributed technologies. And currently the spot market pilots are being organized by provincial governments, and thus there needs to be a stronger focus on creating well-functioning markets that integrate renewables efficiently. And provincial governments are also at the edge of facing the key issues related to coal retirement. And so local governments, provincial and local governments would have to think carefully about coming up with financial mechanisms and transition strategies for displaced workers, as well as helping firms to transition towards cleaner generation sources. In the long term, particularly as land use concerns become very strong and available land is eaten up by renewables such that there's going to be key competition among very important policy priorities such as agricultural land, there's going to be a need for enhanced national level guidance on how renewables can be sited and permitted. As we look out at this time frame, we're also thinking about how to compensate for more flexible conventional resources. So how do we, in this case, how do we compensate for flexible carbon capture? How do we think about flexibility and other resources? And then continuing cost declines and encouraging more learning through the continued deployment of competitive auctions. If we look at the provincial governments, there's going to be an important need to understand where costs are going globally, so provincial governments can plan ahead. Also thinking about potentially where they want to be involved in the supply chain for some of these equipment. And if we think about where that kind of key land use constraint is going to evolve, it's probably going to be at this boundary between agricultural and renewable energy use. And this is a domain that local governments can have a really strong positive impact on thinking about standards as well as how to maybe organize projects that combine both agricultural and renewable energy uses. And just as in the earlier term, we're thinking about market reforms to accommodate time of use pricing and spot markets, compensating mechanisms for DERs because of the vast deployment of distributed solar during this later period, thinking about appropriate compensation mechanisms as an important activity of local provincial governments. So I think I will conclude there, and I welcome comments from my co-authors and the Q&A from the audience.
Great. Thank you so much for that fantastic overview. Now it's my pleasure to really introduce the panel of co-authors and also experts who will be discussing the insights and perspectives on the report, findings and its implications for China's energy decarbonization. So we're really fortunate to have a great panel with us tonight. I'll just introduce the whole group first. So we have Professor Da Zhang, who is an associate professor at the Institute of Energy, Environment, and Economy at Tsinghua University. He's also a research associate at the Joint Program on the Science and Policy of Global Change at MIT. And he's been supporting energy and climate policy analyses for the National Development and Reform Commission, the Ministry of Finance, the Ministry of Ecology and Environment, the National Energy Administration, and the Ministry of Science and Technology. We also have with us Dr. Xi Lu, who's a tenured professor in the School of Environment at Tsinghua University. His primary research area concentrates on modeling complex systems of renewable energy, environment, and climate, integrative solutions for large-scale deployment of wind and solar energy storage, also doing emission inventory of greenhouse gas emissions and air pollutants, as well as carbon neutral urbanization energy systems. We also have with us Zhenhua Zhang, who's a doctoral student in mechanical and aerospace engineering at UC San Diego with a focus on policy questions relevant to electricity markets and energy systems. He combines engineering methods with understanding the political economy to identify the transition strategies toward carbon neutrality, which this report is a great example. And last but not least, we have Dr. Fritz Karl, who's a research affiliate with the California China Climate Institute and also an affiliate with the Electricity Markets and Policy Group at Lawrence Berkeley National Laboratory. He's a power sector expert and works primarily on energy markets, regulation, and policy in the US, China, and India. So welcome to all of you. Thank you so much for being here today. And so just my first question is building off where Michael left off, and just really curious what all of you see as, what are some of these key areas and policy levers where local governments can be leaders in renewable energy deployment, beyond what we usually see as this focus on national targets and planning. So Professor Zhang, do you want to start us off?
Sure. I think, well, this is an important question because provincial and local governments have been playing very important role in the development of China's renewable industry, not only in terms of deploying the renewable capacity, but also in terms of developing the manufacturing capacity, especially for solar industry. I think in terms of this, for the future development of or increase of the renewable share in China's power sector, the manufacturing industry, especially for example, the energy storage, will be very important. I think local government, well, maybe this is industry policy, but they have, I think, very good, important role to play to support the new energy manufacturing industry like the storage. And also, as Michael has already mentioned in his presentation, the policy related to land use, which has very important, local government have very important decision to make, will be increasingly more important in future China's renewable energy development? I'll just stop here.
Okay, I would like to have additional comments to this question. So yeah, as you know, I think the renewable energy development in China have you know, experienced different phases. You know, in the early years, so the largest scale development, they try to build like a so-called wind power basis or solar power basis, which is a large cluster of capacity of wind power, solar power, and the power mostly was transferred to the load center in the coast regions. But more recently, and I talked to the local government and also have paid visit to the Northwest region, and I found many the planning have changed the ideas. So they try to build a industry system, try to attract like a so-called high energy intensive industry, move to the you know, the wind and solar rich regions to take advantage of the low cost renewable energy to consume the energy there. So, and a very interesting phenomenon is they try to build like a industrial parks, try to build an industry chain, and to try to, you know, build like a power generation, utilization, storage together within an industry park. I think maybe this would be also be another trend to the future development of renewables in China. Yeah, that's it.
I do think there's a lot of the driver for this very different electricity system is going to come from a national level. But even within that, I think there's a lot that local governments do, whether it's the US or China, in paving the way for allowing this new system to take place at the scale that we're talking about. I think part of it is local policy, but there's a lot of mechanics, like things like interconnection, so being able to connect relatively rapidly to the electricity grid, things like permitting, and then things like land use planning, like Professor Zhang mentioned. I think local governments play a really important role in those areas. I also think local governments play a really important role on the demand side. So the lowest cost way to get terawatt scale renewables into an electricity system is to have a more flexible demand, where you can either do that by adding more storage into the system, but you can also do that by re-optimizing loads and having more responsive demand. And so I think local governments play a really important role in that as well. And my biggest question is, to what extent is this cycle between large-scale renewable development in the north and northwest of China versus more renewable development along the coast going to be local government driven versus national policy driven? And I think, like in the US, I think there's going to be a lot of discussion about the role of local government in promoting resilience in places like Shanghai or in like Jiangsu. And I think that could be a really important driver of moving more both energy and storage closer to demand. But I think there's going to be this really interesting interplay between national and local governments in China, same in the US.
Yeah, thanks for all of those great analysis of looking at it, both from, you know, what local governments could do kind of on the various perspectives on this question. So another question I have for all of you really looks at, you know, we can see that this transition is not the same across provinces. It really is going to look different in the Western versus Eastern provinces, but also within, you know, those regions. And so, you know, what are some ways that we can ensure that this transition, you know, is more equitable? Welcome anyone who wants to jump in on that question.
I can give it a start on the equity part. So I think overall, academics really like to think about the equity issues because the transition to carbon neutrality is not just about the transition itself, but also extend to other socioeconomic issues. For example, like how do we compensate those who have historically suffered from air pollution in the public health crisis, or will suffer from those extreme weather events down the road if we don't transition too fast? And another issue would be how to design and implement industrial policy for the clean energy sector, as mentioned by Professor Zhang, to promote the job opportunities and economic growth. I think on a high level, I would definitely call for a multi-objective decision framework, which sounds very vague, but I think when it comes to specific issues like co-retirement, like transmission line expansion, what that means is really that we need to add the socioeconomic benefits as well as costs into the equation to see how much are those and how allocated they are. I think in the case of retirement, for example, one key finding of this report is that actually some regions will see a lot of coal plants retire, but with fewer renewable installations to sort of fill this capacity gap. So I think the key point here is that we need to strategically retire or retrofit the conventional plants so that not all of the plants retire overnight, or not one single region or one single province has all of the retirement burden. So I think that's an implication here. And another quick example would be the transmission line expansion. I think the key question here is, how do we allocate the capital costs of those inter-regional, inter-provincial transmission lines? And of course, there's some accounting methodology that has been published by the national government saying, okay, this is how we calculate the capital costs. But when it comes to allocation, we can maybe adopt some kind of beneficiary pay principle where those who benefit from such projects would be able to pay for the capital costs so that you can generate more buy-in from relevant regions. And there are also a ton of other issues. For example, how do we promote the DERs in distributed resources for people living in urban areas? And I'm actually speaking from my parents who are living in apartment condos in Shanghai who doesn't have any land, but only this kind of tiny rooftop space in the gigantic building. So I think that would be another interesting question to look at. But yeah, so that would be my short answer, long answer.
So here's another question. Is there in China, in the US, there's likely to be a grand bargain, meaning there's some states that really don't want to do any of this. And there's some states that, like California, that really want to do this. So most likely states like California are going to have to pay more than their fair share for a lot of the infrastructure. Is there a similar grand bargain in China?
Well, I think I would just quickly add that in China, the situation will also to some extent exist, as you just mentioned, but there are also some differences in terms of the transmission line planning. So that's more or less the responsibility of the grid company. And grid company is a centrally owned, state-owned enterprise. So it's more a central issue. But in terms of the distributed renewable energy deployment, as Tsinghua just discussed, so the local government has more to say, I think, on this. Currently, in some provinces, there have been a lot of recent deployment of the distributing energy. I think maybe in a few years, in these provinces, it will be some integration issues. So maybe it's getting more difficult to deploy distributed renewable in some of these provinces if no further measures to facilitate the integration is taken.
Okay. Yeah, I think in China, yeah, different region provinces face different challenges, especially for the
Professor Lu, are you still there? I think he froze. Okay, maybe we'll go ahead and hopefully he'll be able to come back and finish his thought. I'm going to just jump to the next question, which is really about the project development process.
sorry.
Oh, great.
Yeah, I don't know. Just yeah. Okay. Yeah.
No
Let's. Yeah. So it's maybe yeah. It's the its influence impact really on the whole industry chain from the coal extract, coal mining, transportation, and coal chemistry and the entire coal use, which becomes the key support of their economy. So it's clearly different provinces face different challenges during this transition, when they transition to carbon neutral targets. But I think we have another analysis relevant to this report. So, and if theoretically, maybe we think during the transition, there be a huge opportunity in the northwest, as Michael showed in the PowerPoint, they have rich in wind and solar, and so they should have advantages. But our analysis also shows that if they just serves as a center of to supply the energy, either or traditionally coal or renewable wind and solar, so that actually it's benefit their economy not very much, because even for the renewables, most of the capacity, manufacturing capacity are from the coastal region. So essentially cannot drive up much more economies locally. So they have to have some, during this transition, there must be a industry transfer from east to west regions. I think that's an important trend, and actually something is happening, but it's maybe should be promoted in the future, and to get a equal, as how to say, the fair transition to the carbon neutrality. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you. Those are great points, and I feel like this whole discussion is also bringing up a lot of other interesting questions that would be worth exploring more. So my next question for all of you really looks at the project development process. So if we're thinking about in China 20 years from now, what do you see as how the project development process works for a renewable producer in China? So what are the new processes that exist related to land use or grid integration, or some other areas that you expect to be in place? So really coming back to this question of what does integrated planning for renewables really look like, but at the project scale?
Yeah, I could jump in on this and see if other folks. I can remember 10 years ago, curtailment risk was barely considered in the development of new wind and solar projects, particularly in due diligence. It was hardly looked at by the developers, and the financiers didn't know what to do with that. The grid company wasn't requiring a very extensive grid feasibility report. And we saw what happened, and China's curtailment rate soared 10 to 20% nationally, and even higher, 40, 50% regionally around 2015, 16. And they've since come down, but I don't think that's a permanent trend. I think it's quite clear that curtailment rates are going to go up again. And so it's quite, it seems to me that there's, right now, grid integration and curtailment risk is an important consideration. I think it'll become even more important going forward because you're going to have a lot of local variation in curtailment risk with such high penetration of renewables. So it's going to really matter to the project fundamentals. And then, another example of this is currently there are now fairly coarse requirements on storage for renewable developers. So above a certain threshold, you either have to build the storage on site or participate in some shared storage or purchase some flexibility some other way. These are very rough metrics. They're not really tied very carefully to the local grid integration requirements. And I would argue probably overly conservative and not very cost effective. It's probably not very viable in the long run to maintain these kinds of very coarse requirements. I think there's going to be a need to move towards more differentiated requirements, thinking about, okay, if you are interconnecting, what does your curtailment risk look like? If you are in a very high curtailment region and want to build, are you going to be thinking about, are you going to be required to install storage and what amounts, or are you going to have other ways that you can deal with this curtailment risk, including access to transmission lines, et cetera. So I expect there to be a lot more nuance and differentiation in terms of that integration storage requirement in the future.
Well, I would also like to add a few additional points. I think this is a really good question because that touches upon some issues that related to the real business about deploying the renewables. So if we know some renewable developers in China, and if we talk to them, they will always talk about the permits or permission, or how difficult they get from the government. So that is in Chinese called 路桥. So if you want to have one products approved and then also get all the permission to get it constructed, you will need to get mainly two types of the permission, as Jessica just mentioned. Like one is the grid connection, and another is the land use. But for the land use one, you have to talk to all different departments of the local governments, like the agriculture, natural resources, forestry, like even the like cultural heritage protection, because you have to deal with some related issues when you develop a project. So that's become business actually. But then there are also some issues happen. So the central government recently announced some rules to try to more or less formalize this permission process. But I think this process will become, need to be more standardized in the future, especially when the land use become more constrained in the future. So I guess Michael also mentioned in his presentation, there needs to be a very efficient and effective auction process, maybe for the future projects development, not only for the price, but also maybe for this important process in the business. So I think we like to see more development in this process in the future.
Great. Fritz, go ahead.
So, I mean, if you think about this as a coordination challenge, there are so many different levels. There's the transmission versus distribution. We'll have at least some resources on the a lot of resources probably on the distribution system. We'll have a lot of resources on the transmission system. How do you get the quote unquote right level of resources on each part without the distribution system somehow talking to the transmission system, both in terms of planning and maybe markets and retail prices. So that's one coordination challenge. There's the ministerial coordination challenge, meaning like the land use planning now needs to talk to energy. That's not something that's happened a lot in the past. There's the public-private challenge. How much of the development is driven by private sector, corporate sector versus the government, especially on the transmission system. There's so many coordination challenges. And I think, if you walk to the 2060 view of the world and try to think about how you get there, it's actually really hard to do. But if you think about this as an organic process that evolves over time, then it seems a little bit more manageable. And the question is how incrementally, without having to change everything at once, how can you incrementally change the current system so that different parts of the system that have not historically been well coordinated are better coordinated? I think that's the challenge.
Yeah, a lot of new things we need to learn and address to make this happen in reality.
Yeah, I mean, I'll take Frit's challenge. I do think it's a coordination challenge. And particularly the distributed and transmission, they're really operating under a very different set of incentives. There's really no reason why currently there would be a cost-effective sort of trade-off between transmission and distribution, because transmission resources now are grid parity or forced into auctions or forced into take very low-cost renewable energy contracts, whereas distributed energy received a lot more preferential tariffs. And that's true anywhere, right? We build a lot of distributed solar in California that's probably not economical if you actually traded it off at utility scale. But nevertheless, we have different considerations for that. In this model, we're kind of considering them together, right? We're thinking, okay, we have a lot of renewables to build, and it's going to cost a lot of money. And the interesting finding of this, I think perhaps the most interesting finding, is that we build a lot of distributed just based on the economics of it alone, right? It doesn't happen very much in large bulk power putting models where you would actually allow a trade-off among utility and distributed. Most models, like for example, California's planning models, tend to sort of lock in a certain amount of distributed generation because we just assume the policies and people are going to want to put up their rooftops, and then we optimize around the utility scale. But no, here we're actually optimizing both of them. That's a big assumption, right? It's the assumption that the incentives are matched and we can trade off among those. But what's probably more likely is that provinces and local governments will continue to support distributed renewables with separate tariff schemes that will build them out more quickly than what the cost-effective, cost minimizing model would say. And that's something that we will all have to deal with in our model and address. But I think just an important note that in order to achieve carbon neutrality cost effectively, China needs to build a lot of distributed generation.
John, go ahead.
So I have a question for Michael and his colleagues, co-authors. I mean, this is a fantastic study, and obviously to get to carbon neutrality, China needs to build a lot more. Even though China is building a lot right now, it may not be on pace with the necessary speed to get carbon neutrality. One of the particular missing element, which you have a policy recommendation for, is to make sure that there is something like RPS equivalent requirement for different provinces. So there's a lot of installation target, and there's actually not currently a very ambitious sort of a consumption-based or adoption-based target by different provinces. What do you see the prospect of actually having some sort of a RPS allocate to the provinces in China?
Anyone want to take that? I'll say two very briefly, but I think China's RPS has been very weak and it's not the major driver of renewable energy build out, right? The major drivers are just the costs and the subsidies and other preferential benefits, which are going away, right? With the on-grid tariff. So, you know, what's going to drive renewables deployment going forward when you have this? I mean, my take is there's kind of two competing sort of thoughts here. One is you want the market to function, so you need to have some either cost advantage renewables or some target that constrains policymakers to want to build out a lot of renewables. Or you go through different channels. You know, most of these developers are state-owned enterprises. They're going to have to fulfill carbon neutrality targets as part of their criteria for advancement. And so I think China, you're going to see these kind of two tracks. And if it really seems like renewables are deploying too slow, the sort of political objectives are not enough to kind of, and that cost objective are not enough to kind of push them on, then I think you'll probably see more reliance on the RPS. That's my sense, but I'm also very curious to hear what other folks think about this, the tail of the RPS in China.
Well, yeah, I think that's a very important question. As Michael just replied, I fully agree that his you know, judgment about this like two-track system. Well, currently the RPS is not taking a great role in terms of incentivizing the renewables, but you know, potentially in the future that could be important. But that will requires you know, some strengthening of this policy. For example, in terms of the cost of non-compliance, because since I would say informal or formal instruction in like early 2010, the RPS has not really strong compliance methods to you know, penalize the either local governments or other stakeholders that is responsible for fulfilling these renewable targets. In the future, we will see. So if there's any new measurement that could be taken to enforce this policy if the target is not met.
Yeah. So the RPS many I think is a big driver for the state-owned enterprises. So they, you know, in some big power production companies, so the government have RPS for them. Actually, they have to feel pressure, so have to investment some renewables rather than coal power generation. And I think for the local government, another driver is more important. Is originally it's called we call the two controls. One is the total energy consumption and also the energy intensity. So in the future, maybe we will transfer to translate.
I think Professor Liu froze again.
Local government.
Professor Liu, can you finish that thought one more time, because you froze at the end of it. Oh, he's freezing again. Okay. All right. Well, this is a great conversation, and I feel like we could keep talking for a while. And it's really interesting to have this group all together to reflect on these questions. But given the time, I'm going to have us transition to the audience Q&A portion. We have some great questions in the chat. One question is looking at the land use constraints. And so if someone could please share a bit about how land use plays out in the model, and if there are any constraints beyond agricultural land, if there's any other land use barriers that are important to pay attention to.
Sure, I can actually answer that question. So the key assumption, and of course, the land use is an important aspect of this report. The key assumptions here when it comes to land use is we assume for onshore wind, especially, a lot of types of land can be proper for building onshore wind farms, such as shrublands, barrowlands, croplands, and also given some certain slope preferences, and not at urban areas though. And that's actually the difference when it comes to solar, because for solar, we assume there's this tiny portion of urban areas and a tiny portion of croplands that can be used for both distributed and utility scale solar. And it's another question of for the offshore wind, because we're looking at different metrics such as the distance from the shore and also the water depths in the ocean. So I think the important land use implications of this report, of course, is how do we use land resources more efficiently down the road? And I think there are a few key important aspects to think about. So the first one is how, if we can come up with creative ways to use the same set of land resources for multiple purposes. And I think this morning I actually just read an interesting article about how right now solar developers are collaborating with pig farms to install solar panels on top, because apparently temperature control and air control consume a lot of electricity, and also people are getting better at mitigating the swine fever risks. So they're not too concerned about having all the pigs under the solar panels. So that's an important I think use case for me. And the second question is, how do we reduce the uncertainty when it comes to the project development process, which is also an important part of this talk. I think based on my experiences, actually a lot of project developers, they would identify some proper lands, go through the permitting processes, and then maybe half a year or a year later, they were told by the government that, well, this is not really proper because there are some newly growing bushes on the land. So this land falls into a different category. So there's a lot of uncertainty when it comes to the permitting processes, and which itself is already daunting and very long. So I think the key point here is, how do we make a clear set of rules and make those rules also very certain and also applicable to future cases, which is important legal thinking concept. So those are my thoughts for the land use implications and also constraints.
Great, thank you so much. So I'm going to loop in a few questions all together. So there's these questions about, how does hydrogen, nuclear, and also geothermal fit into China's renewable portfolio? So what's happening and kind of what does that look like moving forward?
Yeah, I can mention a few things. The first is that this analysis assumes a good amount of CCS is deployed. So we have coal CCS, gas CCS, as well as BECCS, bioenergy CCS, to generate some negative carbon sinks in the power sector to offset hard to abate sectors elsewhere. And then we assume we fully exploit China's hydro resources according to current plan, and coastal nuclear is fully exploited. Now, there's a big question right now ongoing in China as to whether or not nuclear will be deployed inland, right? If you just consider coastal regions, you kind of max out around 200 gigawatts. But if you deploy inland, then there really is no upper bound constraint. That's a big ongoing policy question right now that has not been resolved. And it certainly would depend on new nuclear technologies and the extent to which they're going to be deployed. I think the BECCS side, we have a very small amount of bioenergy and CCS, and I think that's acknowledging that the kind of very rosy projections of how you can develop negative emissions from bio really neglect this key competition with agricultural land. And agricultural land and agricultural self-sufficiency is a very important policy objective. And so I think we would not expect a large amount of of bioenergy beyond what we're deploying here. I have not seen a lot of deployment in geothermal in China, and there certainly is exploration. I think it'd be interesting to look into what are the additional potentially with new techniques like, enhanced geothermal, which is very popular now in the United States and opening up some new frontiers there. But I think there's broadly a lot of options for more firm, low carbon power. And if you remove some of them, you're basically going to be moving into more renewables and battery storage, probably at a higher cost. There's going to be some trade-offs there, but I think there's quite a bit of diversity of low carbon resources for China to exploit.
Great. So just in our last few minutes here, I was just hoping everybody could kind of chime in on how this analysis has changed how you think about China's energy decarbonization pathways. And if there's, one thing we could focus on next, like what should it be?
I can start. So how has it changed how I've been thinking about this problem? I think what is always startling about looking to the future, especially when you start to add more deal, is the scale that we're talking about. And I think when you like kind of look out into the future and think, how are we going to do this? It's hard to know where to start. But I think what's interesting and useful about this analysis is it starts this process of thinking, okay, how does the land use component of this work? How do the transmission and distribution components of this work? And it points to things that you can do now to start to facilitate that process over the longer term.
Okay, I'll jump in there. So Fritz sort of stole land use. Really was my key observation and takeaway. My biggest change in my prior thinking, because really we know land use is important because we incorporate it into our model, but really not until running this model did the macro land use constraints really come into view, right? Because we're used to seeing these pictures of like the United States. They're like, oh, we could power the entire United States with this small square, all utilities, all solar, and we're like, oh, that's so simple. How could you ever run into a land use constraint? But actually, when you think about building out such massive amount and connecting a transmission infrastructure and competing for land use, and in a country like China with significantly higher population, very high agricultural land use because there is a lot of small landholding farmers, that the macro land use constraints come into view, right, in a way that was not really that apparent in historic. And so I think that also points to where to focus, which is greater resolution on our land use data, right? Beyond just remote sensing, we need to have better data on where governments are prioritizing renewables, what are they thinking about, what are some degraded lands or other kinds of boundaries where renewables can be deployed to help mitigate some land use conflicts. I think we just need a lot more data and analysis at a very, very granular level.
Well, I would also like to jump in quickly. I think land use is indeed one important issue, and I think in our future discussion with some relevant government agencies, we will pass our results to them and just show, there's a huge amount of renewable to be deployed, and how we can coordinate different ministries or agencies to support this process. And the land, also includes the ocean or, the water body, like for wind, and we need a lot of coordination, even more difficult than PV solar. Another very important issue I would like to quickly cover, but we briefly mentioned in today's discussion, but not that deeply. I think that was a separate discussion. That is the market mechanism to support the deployment or investment of renewables, because currently we more or less rely on the state's investment to incentivize the renewables, maybe in the next 5 or 10 years. But later we need to figure out more effective market mechanism to make sure that renewables can become still a profitable investment, and at the same time to also have some supporting equipment or facilities like storage or even transmission to get invested with the pace of the wind and solar development.
Yeah, I would like additional comments. Yeah, I think the beyond the development of renewables, I think right now is also an important time to explore the flexibility of electricity use in the demand side, on the demand side. So like in China, some cities and all start to build the so-called virtual power plant and try to explore to take advantage of the the flexible load from either buildings or the charging stations, EV charging stations, and IDC centers and so on to try to to basically to originally the flexible resources are distributed and they're not coordinated, and so actually play a very small role. And in the future, I think is pretty important. In addition to the energy storage, I think the demand side response would be an important sector for the sustainable development of renewables.
Yeah, I know we're running a little bit over time, but my quick response will be on the transmission lines, especially in less land constrained areas. So I think we're thinking of transmission lines as an alternative of building resources in demand centers. So this alternative is actually really dependent on the formation of regional electricity markets. So I think we'll definitely focus on more on the question of how we should optimize the wholesale electricity market designs to further ensure that this assumption can actually hold and to further resolve the land use conflicts.
Great. Thank you all so much. I really enjoyed our conversation today. I also want to thank our audience for joining us. We really appreciate everybody's time and participation in the discussion. We encourage everyone to take a look at the report. We have a summary for policymakers in Chinese and also in English, and to please share it with your colleagues. This event has been recorded and it will be available later on CCCI's website, also on our YouTube channel. So we just want to, thank you all so much. This is a great conversation, really enjoyed it. Hope to see you all soon. Have a great day and night.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thanks.
Bye.
Okay.